awaiting Moshiach. Tomorrow we'll be observing the fast of Asara B'Teves, the 10th of the Hebrew month of Teves. This is a fast in which we commemorate how, before the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, the first temple, the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem, on the 10th of Teves. That siege lasted for a couple of years. Following that was the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem on the 17th of the month of Tammuz, which is the second fast day that we do related to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Then we have Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash itself, of the holy temples themselves. And then we have on the third day of Tishrei, we have Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia, which was when the remnant of the Jewish people in the land of Israel after the first Beis HaMikdash, that remnant was destroyed and exiled due to the death of Gedalia ben Achikam, who was the governor of the Jewish people at that time. So there is a very interesting question that I saw. This question and the answer to it, which is a very novel idea, I saw brought down from Reb Shlomo Fisher. Shlomo Fisher is a Rav in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, and he asked the following question. When it comes to the fasts of the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, we find that there was something that happened before the actual breaching of the walls, or before the actual destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Something on those days, on the 17th of Tammuz or on Tisha B'Av, happened before that designated those days as days of punishment, of days of tragedy for the Jewish people. So, for instance, the Mishnah tells us that on the 17th of Tammuz is when the Chet Ha'egel, the sin of the golden calf, took place. That sin, that tragic sin, designated that day as a day of tragedy. That day became the day that the walls of Yerushalayim were breached. Tisha B'Av, the Mishnah tells us, was when the sin of the spies, when the spies returned, causing the Jewish people to reject the land of Israel. And that day became the day designated for tragedy. That became the day when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The question is, what happened on the 10th day of Teves? What happened beforehand that designated it as a day of tragedy for the Jewish people? So Rabbi Fisher, again, I saw this cited a section from his writings, that he suggests that the sin that took place on the 10th day of Teves, perhaps it was the sin of Yosef being sold by his brothers. That took place on the 10th day of Teves. And he writes that he doesn't have any kind of proof for it, but there is an allusion to it. And the allusion could be a remez, a hint, an allusion to it, which could be the fact that in the zodiac sign for the month of Teves, Capricorn, which is a goat, it is the sign for the month of Teves. And we know a goat is a symbol for the sin of the brothers selling Yosef, because it was a goat that they slaughtered and dipped his special coat in blood to show Yaakov that Yosef was torn apart by a wild animal. It was an integral part of their sin. So a goat is a symbol of the sin of the sale of Yosef. So Rabbi Fisher, again, suggests, it's a very novel idea, that what happened on the 10th day of Teves, that designated it as a day of punishment for the Jewish people, was the sale of Yosef. The sale of Yosef, we know, was a manifestation or the result of the jealousy and the hatred that the brothers had for Yosef. The disunity that existed amongst them was that tragedy, that sin and that tragedy that designated the 10th of Teves as a day of tragedy for the Jewish people. And we know, as the Talmud tells us, that sinas chinam, baseless hatred amongst the Jewish people, was the sin that caused the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, the second temple. Which means that this day that we're observing the fast of the 10th of Teves is a day to contemplate and think about this event, the sale of Yosef that took place on that day, and the cause of it, which is a lack of unity amongst ourselves, hatred, jealousy. All this was the cause for the sale of Yosef, and eventually became the cause for the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. It's a very, very unique idea, very interesting, very novel idea to suggest that, because we don't know when we don't have an actual source that says that the sale of Yosef took place on the 10th day of Tevet. But this is what he wants to suggest, that it took place on the 10th of Tevet, which designated it now as a day for punishment and destruction for the Jewish people, as we find in the 17th of Tammuz and by Tisha B'Av. Now I'd like to share with you an excerpt from a book that is it's called Rav Asher Weiss on the Parsha. Rav Asher Weiss is a very prominent rabbi in Yerushalayim, and he is writing this regarding Parshas Vayechi, this week's Parsha, which is the last Parsha of the book of Bereshis. And the excerpt from the book goes like this. Of all the episodes discussed in Sefer Bereshis, Yosef's is surely related at the greatest length and is the most detailed. The story of his dreams, his conflict with his brothers, his slavery and imprisonment, his rise to power, the reuniting of his family, spanned the course of 4 parshias, 4 Torah portions, almost 1/3 of the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis. In contrast, the lives of the others of the patriarchs themselves are described in far less detail. Surely, this is because Yosef's story has the greatest relevance to our own lives. It was the senseless hatred between the brothers that ultimately led to their descent into Egypt, where their children were enslaved and tortured for hundreds of years. Then he cites, many generations later, punishment was again exacted when Rabbi Akiva and 9 fellow Tanoim, 9 fellow sages, were executed by the Romans to atone for the sin of the 10 brothers who sold Yosef into slavery. The Asar Arugei Malchus, the 10 martyrs, which is something that we recite on Yom Kippur in the Musaf services. We also recite it in the Kinnis on Tisha B'Av. The 10 martyrs, the 10 great Tanoi sages of the times of the Mishnah that were murdered by the Romans. And we have a tradition, we have a source that says that that was actually an atonement for the 10 brothers who sold Yosef. So he says that it comes out that this episode of Yosef has so much relevance to us. It brought the Jewish people down to Egypt. It was the cause for the Asara U'Gemalchus, for the 10 martyrs. And he doesn't mention, but again, because the senseless hatred that started with the brothers was the cause for the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, the second temple. He continues, although we cannot claim to understand the depths of Hashem's judgment of his ultimate plan for his nation, it is quite clear the direct cause of our suffering, both now and throughout our history, from the examples as we mentioned, is the justifiable strife and bickering among us. And we conclude Sefer Bereshis and the narrative of the lives of the Avos, of the patriarchs, with this one crucial message, which calls out to each and every one of us. The senseless bickering among us is the cause of our troubles. Only by bridging the gaps between our hearts can we hope to be redeemed. May it be soon in our days. Something we should think about on this Tisha B'Av. On this Asar B'Teves, on the 10th day of Teves. When we are commemorating the first step of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Gullus that we are in now, we have to think about what first happened on that day, the sale of Yosef by his brothers, which was the result of the hatred amongst them, of the disunity amongst them, to think about how we can improve on that so that we should not have to fast on the 10th of Teves or on any other fasts that commemorate the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Because with rectifying this sin, which as Rabbi Weiss mentions, as many mention, is so much the cause of our suffering throughout our history and continues now in our Gullus, that when we work to rectify that, that'll be a merit that brings us closer to the point of time that the prophet says that the 4 fasts that we commemorate for the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash will turn into holidays. May we see that very soon. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This has been a little bit of light. Thank you for listening.